Welcome to A Room Where It Happened. We are today discussing episode 6, or I should say room 6. And this is something that I think will be very interesting to people, certainly something I've been looking forward to for a very long time. We will be discussing the disaster surrounding STS-51L that many people will understand as the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster that occurred on January 28th, 1986. This was a very important space shuttle mission. It was one that had a lot of fanfare because it was the first teacher in space. And that's something that gained a lot of notoriety from the press. And so there was a lot more attention on this mission at that time. So it'll be a very exciting episode. And I'm joined by some usual friends here and a friend that we haven't seen for a while here. So I will, as always, have everybody introduce themselves. Obviously, I'd be able to introduce myself. I'm Eric Rush. This is my second time in the host seat for A Room Where It Happened, but I'm joined by Don. Don, say hello.
Hello.
And Chris.
Hi.
Great. And so we are also joined by a friend who we haven't seen for a while. So I'd like to give a special welcome to Dean Rogers, who's joining us today. Dean.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
All right, very good. And so when we come back, we will be dissecting the Challenger mission, and we will be discussing not only the events that happened that everybody's aware of, but we'll be diving deep into what happened in mission control. We'll be diving even deeper into what the failures of that mission are and what the end result was for the space program, and also reforms that were done to ensure that something like this didn't happen again.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart, groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Room Where It Happened. We are going to be discussing, again, the STS-51L, the Challenger mission that occurred on January 28th, 1986. This is something, again, that is sort of one of the big events of my childhood. And I think that there's a lot of things or a lot of historical events that occurred in modern times that I think we all remember where we're at. And on one of our previous rooms, we talked about where we were all at on September 11th, 2001. And for me, this is an event that is just as notable, and it's one that I remember just as well. So, we will be discussing this later in the podcast, but this is certainly something that is near and dear. So I think, Don, we'd probably, one of the things that would be good to start out with is to discuss the mission itself, and maybe a little bit to discuss what actually happened on live TV, because this is an event that happened on live TV.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me, just to put it in context. I know, Eric, you mentioned that you were in was it first grade, second grade?
I was in first grade.
First grade.
I was 6 years old.
Dean had mentioned when we were talking off podcast that he was in the military at the time. I don't know where Chris was. Chris was probably reading something about 19th century European history, for all we know, probably at that moment.
I was alive. I have no memory of this. If
Okay.
I'm being perfectly honest. I was in bed with like a Bismarck mobile over my. It was France and Germany and yeah.
Yeah,
Well, this is one of those-
that much I can believe, Chris. I can believe that like I can believe anything. I was actually a senior in high school, and so one of the things that I will be sharing about in terms of my personal experience, I think I'd like for all of us to share our personal experience at some point as we go through this. I think it's very enlightening, and I'm sure our listeners will all, as you pointed out, Eric, will have their personal experience, which brings some of the revelation that's there. But I actually found myself for my high school senior trip called Close Up. For those of you that are familiar with that program, our Close Up trip was a couple of weeks after the disaster. And so we were actually in Washington, D.C. post Challenger while the flags were still at half mast. And in fact, while we were in Washington, D.C. for Close Up was when the State of the Union actually happened that year, which originally had been planned for the night that this particular event actually happened. So my connection, I remember being in a significant place, the place that seemed closer to it in some ways, DC, but being a native Houstonian, had come from a place that was obviously very close to it. So I sort of felt like I had the double connection of being a Houstonian in DC after there'd been a space disaster, because both of those places are relevant to what's going on with the story and what's happening there.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to me is that there really is a bright line here for people. Do you remember the Challenger accident? Do you not remember the Challenger accident? And I have friends that are in their mid 30s that there aren't a whole lot younger than I am, but yet they not only do they not remember it, they didn't exist yet. And so it's kind of this bright line for people who remember the accident and who don't remember the accident. And it's funny, Chris, that you mentioned that you have really no memory of this, and we're not that different in age, Chris.
Yeah, I know. You've mentioned a couple of times in other things like, when we were growing up in the 80s. I was growing up in the 80s. I have memories of 89.
Oh, okay. Okay. So it is a little bit different, right?
I guess I'm on the far end of all of that discussion. I was already married in the Army and had my son at that point. I was only 19 though, so.
Okay. Well, so a very diverse group of experiences at that point. So Don, maybe we could start out the discussion by actually seeing the launch and talking a little bit about what happened during the launch, and then we can start to dive in deep about what we know happened, both in the room and outside of the room.
Engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
I wanted to pause right there,
Yeah.
Eric. Just the image that we can see. This is one of those things we may try as a video podcast, like we've done here with one of the recent episodes of A Fork in Time, is that huge plume of fire.
Huge plume of fire, and this huge plume of fire is mostly coming from the solid rocket boosters at this point.
Yeah.
And so what you saw there in the video was main engine ignition that occurs around -6. So you're about 6 seconds before liftoff. And then what you see is the shuttle liftoff, and we'll say everything starts about at time 0, but there's just a little bit of a delay. And then after a second or two, it clears the tower. And then what we're seeing now for the shuttle is what's called the roll program that happens between about 7 and 10 seconds. And what this is it's a pitch and roll maneuver for the space shuttle that allows it both better aerodynamic characteristics, that allows it to have a higher payload. And it also allows the astronauts to have a little bit better vision of the horizon outside of the video. And so there are some safety aspects to the pitch and roll maneuver. But that's one of the things you'll see whenever you see a shuttle launch. It'll look like it's sort of twisting and leaning back as it clears the tower, or soon after that. And so this is completed by about 10 seconds. And it was a perfectly successful roll maneuver. At this point, there was really no knowledge that anything was wrong.
And the other thing that always struck me about that was, the fact that they literally are moving over to go onto their back.
Under their back, yeah.
Yeah, and always trying to grasp that as a kid. One of the other things I remember, I remember talk about I'll chase a rabbit here, but it's relevant. One of the ways that I can know where I'm dealing with video from one of the very early launches, the later launches, is they stopped bothering to paint the large external fuel tank, which the biggest thing that you see there is the fuel tank. And I think it was the first 4 launches, they had painted them white. So if you see this beautiful white shuttle with these nice white solid rocket boosters and the big white tank, you're watching like one of the first 4 launches because they stopped painting the tank. And I remember as a kid, the first launch was in 81. So I was 13 when that happened. I remember that distinctly. And I can remember later, it's that ugly rust color. Why don't they paint the tank? And then I remember just the weight of that paint on the tank. And that meant that was payload that you could not, transfer it into what you could carry in the shuttle itself. Okay, we'll take the uglier shuttle launch to be able to carry a little bit more into orbit, plus not have to waste the time of actually painting a large tank. So,
and unlike the SRBs that they will retrieve from the ocean and refurbish and to use them again, the external tank, it burns up in reentry. So it persists a lot longer, and so it burns up in reentry. And so why bother to make something pretty when it's just going to burn it up in reentry?
Yeah, I'm going to get us started back here. That was just my little insert there. Eric, take it back.
Roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Throttle down to 94. Throttling down now.
So they said throttle down to 94 there, Eric. What's that all about?
So you have your main engines that you can actually alter the thrust on. And depending on where it is in the launch, these main engines may be functioning anywhere between 65% and 104%, depending on where you're at. And so where they are in the launch, it is appropriate for them to throttle back to 94% because when you're first launching, the engines are running at about 104%, if memory serves. And so they're throttling back. And one of the things that you can't hear or you can't hear in this video, but that you can hear in some other, especially if you're actually getting the feed from mission control, is around this time. So we're about 15, 20 seconds after launch. And so one of the things that was commented on is the pilot, Michael Smith, actually commented on the wind, and that there was a lot of wind going on. And at 22 seconds, then the mission commander, Dick Scobie, had actually commented on difficulty seeing from the window. So it was a little different. So maybe we're getting some hints that things are not exactly normal or not exactly optimal at this point. Certainly, there was no idea that this is going to be catastrophic at this point.
Okay. And the other thing is just, I know we talked about this, I think, off podcast. The engines that are adjustable here are the engines on the back of the shuttle, because the two large engines, the 2 solid rocket boosters, are solid propellant. They're on, and once they're on, they're going. You can't adjust their flow. You can't do anything except wait for them to exhaust what they have and or disconnect from them.
And as the shuttle gets higher in altitude, there are several maneuvers that occur. Now, we don't get there with Challenger, but if we looked at a successful launch, we would see that as they exhaust their fuel, that there is a maneuver that is SRB separation, where they actually the solid rocket boosters will move away from the orbiter and the external tank, and a parachute will deploy, and they'll drop down into the ocean and be retrieved. So if we look at this for on a successful mission, you would see go for SRB separation. Right. And then once you get further up in altitude, then you'll separate from the external tank, which will then will burn up in reentry, as I mentioned before. So, but we never get there.
Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel lines.
Okay, stop if you pause, Don. So what you're seeing now, or what we're starting to see here that they didn't see immediately, is if you look really carefully on you'll see an extra set of some more flame as the shuttle is kind of rolling over on its back, that's coming out of the joint, that rear joint on the right SRB. And that's going to, that fuel, well, so let me back up. So if we look at the footage from multiple angles as this is being investigated later on, this is not something you can see in 73 seconds, but as this is being investigated, what is clear is that there is a leak in the right SRB very quickly, and within a second of launch, there's a leak, and it's not flame at first; it's just gas that's leaking out, but eventually it catches on fire. But what happens is there's actually a plug of solid fuel that kind of plugs this leak. And so between about 1 second and probably about 40 seconds, you're really not seeing anything that's going on with that right SRB. And then the fuel becomes dislodged because the fuel's being consumed at just this enormous rate. And so you're consuming the fuel, and this fuel plug becomes dislodged. And so you're going to start seeing this flash of flame kind of shooting out from the side of the right SRB, and that's a real problem because it's not the right SRB does not function in a vacuum. It's sitting right next to the external tank. That's not good to have flame that you don't have control of. That is there at that point. So,
Eric, I believe that the investigation actually determined that it was 58 seconds into the launch that the flame appears.
That's exactly right.
Right.
So about 40 seconds, you can start seeing gas. You can start seeing there, and then at 58 seconds, the flames can be seen. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and they have an image, not in this video, but from another angle at the engine ignition, where you get to see the actual black smoke, which is actually going to be soot, spray out at 0.6 seconds. 0.6 seconds after ignition, it was already doomed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other thing that I remember, as we saw countless, videos as the investigation went on, it was the Rogers Commission, if I'm remembering correctly, was the commission that was put. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about, their findings as well. And was there political pressure and other, there's the whole, there's the science of what caused this, and there's the what else of what caused this, which I think are both compelling reasons to talk about and look at. But what I remember is then they went back and saw a number. You would see they showed video of prior launches to the Challenger launch, where there had been, if you look closely at the, you saw something similar, a small plume of fire, something that wasn't natural if you just paid attention closely to previous video. It's just that, well, when everything goes okay, you really go back and scrutinize the video. And then the question came, well, somebody's job was to scrutinize the video. They had to have seen that, right? And then they chose to ignore that. So I'm sure we'll talk about that at another point. And just by the way, for our listeners' benefit, the link to this is just a YouTube video. So there'll be a link in the show notes so you can go back and see exactly what we're talking about here, as many as some of the other pictures that we'll include it as well.
4.3 nautical miles, average distance 3 nautical miles. Throttle up, 314. Adjust throttle up, our engine now at 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up.
Okay, so if you'd pause it here, Don. So what we're seeing here is a different angle for the shuttle. And things go badly very fast at that point. So as Dean had correctly mentioned, it was at 58 seconds that you can start seeing flames by the right SRB, and that progressed very quickly once that happened. And within 6 seconds, what you saw is actually flame burning through the liquid hydrogen tank on the ET. Well, again, that's not good. That's not what you want at all. And what that eventually resulted in is it resulted in the lower right SRB strut failing. And then you have the SRB actually move away from the external tank. And this caused huge differences in acceleration, huge problems with the external tank. And eventually what you're seeing is the right SRB kind of slams into the external tank and pushes the liquid hydrogen and the oxygen together in the external tank, and the multiple explosions occur, and eventually it takes within a second of this happening, you see the orbiter start to break up and the external tank start to explode. And you can see flames shooting out of the external tank, which you don't want. You don't want flames shooting out of the external tank. There's the explosion.
100 feet per second, altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And what you're seeing here is you're seeing this explosion, and you're seeing these two contrails, and what they are is you have the two SRBs that are kind of going in wildly different directions. And so you see a central explosion, and you see the SRBs are kind of shooting off, and eventually a few seconds later, the NASA, their mission control, there's a kind of a fail-safe there to explode them, or to and so they don't go somewhere they ought not be.
Yeah, they're sort of they're untethered. They're just loose. There's nothing to guide them other to guide them other than their inertia, and they really are not aerodynamically designed constructs. They're designed to be attached to something that's aerodynamic, so they're moving on. And again, we'll have the video as a link in the show notes. Stupid podcast being an audio medium, it's just so frustrating sometimes. But the thing that I mentioned this, and then I'll let Eric take back over and let the other guys jump in. It always struck me when I saw the thing is it's right after the go for throttle up. Mm-hmm. And I remember talking to people, at that time, somehow thinking that the throttle up had, that something about throttling back up had actually caused this to happen. As far as I understand it, no, it was just the timing of what, as Dean said, the die had been cast a fraction of a second into the launch once, this the O-ring has failed the way that it's going to fail, and the propellant plug is not going to be there to resolve things. It had nothing to do with the fact that they were throttling back up. It was just the time had come when this was now going to fail in a way that was going to cause a fireball. And I guess one of the things you had mentioned, Eric, is it fair to say that there was an explosion, or really was it just what was it?
Well, there were explosions, but what appears to have happened, and again, I'm not an astronaut, I'm not a pilot, I'm not an aerospace engineer, I'm just an enthusiast. But what appeared to happen is that you had the strut fail on the right SRB, and that changed the kind of the way the orientation of the SRB to the external tank was, and that you had a compromise of the external tank. And keep in mind, the external tank is liquid hydrogen and oxygen. These are volatile, and so it is pretty clear that there were explosions in the external tank, and that these were, as far as we can tell, a significant part of what ultimately destroyed the orbiter.
Chris, I'm actually curious to hear your perspective on things. I remember this.
Yeah.
Dean remembers it. Eric remembers it. But so your exposure to this event, the event that Eric's walked us through here and that we've been talking about, was no different than your exposure to any other type of history. Somebody telling you about it, you're seeing something about it, you're watching something about it. I guess my question for you is, do you feel maybe it's connected to it as that's an odd way to ask, because we obviously have the connection that we do. I've mentioned mine, Eric's mentioned his, and Dean's mentioned the timing on his. Does it feel somewhat disconnected for you?
It does. It does. I don't have a frame of reference for it, if I'm being perfectly honest. And the weird thing to me is, in our shows, we've explored a lot of different topics, and yet in just about every one of them, and I think Eric and I definitely remember a couple of ours, I've had my family feels a little like Forrest Gump. That there've been these connections to it, even stuff that happened before my lifetime, but there was some kind of and for this there's not, if I'm being honest.
Interesting.
So does I guess one of the things that the reason I asked that question, I think that brings the benefit perhaps of a detachment that's probably a negative, like you've just expressed there, but also that probably is a positive in the sense of you don't have the same emotional connection to it, perhaps, that you don't have to listen to Eric Long to know that he's an enthusiast when it comes to things space. And so, to see this as a kid, as a young kid, as a first grader, pretty dramatic. I was a senior in high school, so it's not that, it's not that I wasn't overly jaded. I was beginning to be jaded, but I wasn't overly jaded yet. But, the way that an 18-year-old looks at it is going to, and I wasn't 18 yet. I guess I was on the verge of 18 here. My birthday's in early February. So as a 17-year-old looks at this is different than how a first grader is going to look at it. And when you're looking back at events, I guess my point, Chris, is to you, this event and the Kennedy assassination are the same in the sense of, where were you when it happened? In one case, not alive. In the other case, I don't have any recollection of it, even though you were alive.
No. And this is the weird thing is my mother was in elementary school when the Kennedy assassination happened, and my father was on an Air Force base in Suffolk County, Long Island. And they went on full alert because they did not know what had just happened.
Again,
even for Kennedy, like I was saying, that kind of Forrest Gump, no, there was some connection to that has, even if it wasn't part of my life experience, that has been passed down.
Yeah, and I always got that from my parents. The Kennedy assassination was, my parents would have been, my mother would have been an 8th grader, and my father was a freshman in high school. But they were old enough to be able to have a perspective on it and to remember where they were. And this is one of those first historical events that I have a really good memory for. I mean, again, I was in first grade. I was only 6 years old, but I have a very clear memory of this. And part of it is just, again, I was a space enthusiast. I was already a space enthusiast. If you asked me at 6 what I wanted to do for a living, I would have said I wanted to, and I actually told my parents this. I said I want to be an astronaut in the morning and I want to be a doctor in the evening. And I tell people I got halfway there. But part of it was just also, I didn't, there was nothing dissuading me from being an astronaut because I'd never really seen any consequences to the astronauts. Our space program had been, Apollo 1 aside, had been extremely successful, and we hadn't lost anybody. And so that was a good thing, but it also it was a very different frame of reference. And so sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to launch into kind of my story, Dean. So if you had a thought, then that would be great.
I have a question for you when you're done.
Oh, great. That's even better. So as Don mentioned, I was a first grader, and I watched every shuttle launch of Intel Challenger. And then I didn't watch as many of them. But and when I say every shuttle launch from when I could remember, and so a lot of them, the shuttles would launch at 8:30, approximately 8:30 Eastern time, which was 7:30 Central time. So I was growing up in Kansas at this point, and I would make sure, and my mother was really good about this, about making sure we knew when the shuttle launches were. And at this point, kind of in that 84 to 86 time period, our shuttle launch schedule was really ambitious. We had a lot of launches going on, probably too ambitious, which is one of the concerns of the Rogers Commission. But I just remember a lot of mornings when we were able to watch the shuttle launches. And for this morning, we were supposed to watch the shuttle launch. I was supposed to watch it at home before I went to school. But because of the weather, and we'll come back to the weather, they postponed it until later in the morning. And so it didn't actually launch until about 11:30 Eastern time, so about 10:30 Central time. So I was already in school at this point. Well, everybody watched the shuttle launches at this point. So my first grade teacher wheeled the monitor on the metal cart in, and we watched the shuttle launch in class, and everything seemed fine. We watched the launch, watched clear the tower, and then 73 seconds later, it exploded. And my first grade teacher just went over to the TV, turned it off, and we went about our day. And I will never forget what we did next, because it's so different. So those of you who are Kansans, both of you who are Kansans that listen to the podcast will know that January 29th is Kansas Day. And so we went immediately from watching the shuttle launch to making artwork celebrating Kansas Day the next day. And I'll never forget that either. because seems it's in such opposition. It's such a different set of activities. But that's what I remember. The other thing I remember is all of a sudden I didn't want to be an astronaut anymore. Wow. Now that I saw what could happen, because I didn't want to. I was 6 years old. I didn't want to die in an explosion. I still don't want to die in an explosion. That kind of it killed my desire to actually be an astronaut professionally. It didn't touch my enthusiasm about space and about space travel. It just changed it. So Dean, what's your question?
So my question is, since you were and are such a space enthusiast, did you ever make it to the Johnson Space Center?
Yeah, I've been to Johnson Space
before it became the commercialized attraction that it is today.
It didn't. I would say when I went to the Johnson Space Center, it didn't feel commercial. I would have gone to Johnson Space Center in 1991, so I would have been 12 in summer of 1991, and then we went to Kennedy Space Center a couple of years later when we just happened to be on vacation in Florida. So I got a chance to go to both of those, and I got to go to Space Camp as well in 1994. Cool. So that was, again, still a space enthusiast. And I knew hey, that's the closest I'm ever going to be to being an astronaut, was in Space Camp. And it was worth it. It was amazing.
Well, my story is kind of similar to yours, but I'll also say that I think it runs parallel to much of America. I'm old enough that I remember the Apollo missions, and I remember watching the last of them. I've still got clear memories of the last moon landings and the moon buggy and all of that. Around 1970 or 1971, I made my first trip to the Johnson Space Center, and it's nothing like it is today. It was open to the public, but it was mainly a business. They were doing astronaut business, space business, but they gave guided tours. And back then it was really cool for kids because they allowed you to crawl into the spaceships, the landing capsules and the orbiter. I mean, it was amazing experience back then. And one of the things I got on one of my trips was I got a set of, I guess they were press release artwork done for the shuttle program. This was probably 73 or 74. And I remember seeing the painting of this space shuttle on the Boeing jet as it would eventually be, carried around, and thinking that was really cool. And like you, I had, a short time in my life, mine maybe not so long as yours, that I thought being an astronaut would be cool, especially if it was like flying a plane. And I remember it was about 77 that we first heard that the public would be able to ride in the space shuttle. And it was the whole NASA was making space for everyone. It wasn't just for astronauts. And adults around me were talking about, what they would do if they could fly on it, how much it was going to cost, and all of this, things that are more contemporary now with all of the privatized flights. And like most Americans, I guess we moved to the Houston area in 79. And shortly after we moved here, they transported the shuttle, and it literally flew right over top of my elementary school. And that was cool. You could just look up, and everybody in the school went outside to see the space shuttle fly over. And when the first launch happened in 81, and then when it returned, and it was a big event, and everybody was excited. And then it became routine. Mm-hmm. And, I was a teenager by then, and off in my own little teenage world, and met my wife and joined the Army. And, I was aware of the space shuttle, especially being in the military. We heard things all the time, but it wasn't that excitement. Space had kind of become routine and normal business. And I remember the day that it happened, I was in language school in Monterey, and one of our instructors threw the door open to the classroom and just yelled, kind of in an awkward, emotional state, "The space shuttle just blew up," and then closed the door. And we all just sort of looked at each other in shocked silence, like, is that a joke? Surely not the American space shuttle, right? So that's my journey on that. And I think it parallels a lot of Americans, because while I won't go so far to say that the whole Teacher in Space program was a stunt, to some degree, I do think it was to sort of reinvigorize the public support for NASA, especially as funding cuts and things had become more of the norm in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Dean, because the irony to me of the shuttle program, which the shuttle program is born while the tail end of Mercury is happening. I guess we're sliding into Gemini at that point when they're talking about, what will be the next thing, after successful moon landing. And, this idea of STS, you mentioned the designation is STS. It's the Space Transportation System. Mm-hmm. T, transportation. It's supposed to be routine. The very thing you're talking about, Dean, ironically, the very thing that struggle to keep funding happening, because it would become so routine. I was thinking about the movie Apollo 13, or just, remember they wouldn't cover the thing from, how routine that had become, just, two flights later. So to me, the irony, sort of thinking about the Apollo program, what eventually kills the Apollo program before all of the planned flights actually happen. Apollo 17 was not supposed to be the last time that we had been on the moon. And as you said, what happened there in the period, probably from about 83, 80, the period of time you're talking about there, 84 through like 86, when the launch tempo had picked up and was much more frequent. And it, again, I think we mentioned this off podcast, maybe we mentioned on podcast, they weren't even in spacesuits when they were launching now. They were flying in, jumpsuits with helmets. It seemed safe because they weren't even getting in those special looking, pressurized things that looked like they were designed for safety or whatever they were needed for. And so to me, the irony of the shuttle program, in a lot of ways, the irony of space programs in general, is when they become complacent, there's a complacency that sets in that, particularly when it's government funded, it's hard to get the backing for. But it was supposed to become that regular. So that there's that natural tension that's built into it. And in fact, the other thing, I think this is a good place probably to introduce, why did they choose to launch that morning? You mentioned, Eric, that they pushed the launch back that morning because of temperatures. What's the argument for, well, why not wait till the next day? It's probably it's Florida. It's not going to stay cold forever, right? I mean, it'll be warmer the next day. Why launch?
Well, and we can talk about this in detail, but part of the reason is because there'd been so many delays with this. This mission had really been plagued by a number of scheduling problems. And so one of the things that is not well known is that this mission had originally been scheduled for December 1985 and had been pushed back to, originally it was pushed back to January 23rd. And then on the 22nd, because of issues with the launch site, because they had this really ambitious cycle of launching these vehicles. They pushed it back to the 25th, they pushed it back to the 26th. But then on the 26th, the weather wasn't good because of wind. In this case, it was mostly because of wind, and so it was postponed to the 27th. And so on the morning of the 27th, they got all the astronauts, they woke them up, they got them strapped in, they were there, they were ready to go. But then there was this like hatch handle that had malfunctioned. And so they needed the hatch handle to be fixed. And so they fixed the problem. But by the time that they fixed the problem, then the weather was again unacceptable due to a high crosswind. And so they scrubbed the mission for the 27th and they postponed it again to the 28th. The problem was, so overnight on the 28th, it was cold. It wasn't, and uncharacteristically cold for Florida. It was into the 20s. Now, to me, that seems crazy. I've never been to Florida where it's been. I don't think I've ever been to Florida where it's under about 50 degrees. and it was cold, and not just cold, there was a bunch of ice that had accumulated on the launch pad. And so, but the engineers did an assessment of that, and they said, okay, let's continue. We're going to, because they have to. So well, I'll back up a little bit. So you don't just come and, you don't just unwrap the cellophane off your shuttle and stick it on the launch pad and expect it to launch. There's infrastructure. There's a lot of steps that go into making a shuttle launch. And one of the steps that's really important is you have to fill the external tank, because they don't just come, pre-filled with liquid hydrogen and oxygen. You got to stick it in there. And that's a very time-consuming and technologically sophisticated process. And so they actually fueled from the ground station, but there was a problem with the ground station. And so they had to pause for several hours. But they still got the astronauts up on the 28th. They still got them around. They got them strapped in. And so they were actually ready to go at about 8:30 Eastern time. But the problem was, or the decision was, they said, okay, we're going to go ahead and wait a little bit longer because we want more of this ice to melt off. They were worried about the ice. And yeah, the ice is not good, but it's not the ice itself that was the problem. It was the fact that it was cold enough to have ice that was the problem. And so they decided to have it melt a little bit more, and they pushed the mission off for a couple of hours. And so it lifted off again about 11:30 Eastern time. And that's when we kind of catch up to the launch that we saw in the video. And so cold is not good for certain parts of this. And that was one of the things that was eventually discussed, is that you had parts in particular, this part that became part of the public vernacular, the O-ring. Nobody had ever heard of an O-ring before 1986, but boy, did we ever hear about it the rest of 1986. And it had only been rated to, if memory serves, 39 degrees Fahrenheit, so about 4 degrees centigrade. But it was 27 degrees in Florida at the time, so it launched 27 degrees, so a full 12 degrees cooler than what it should be. And what we eventually found out later, and due in no small parts to the physicist Richard Feynman, when he served on the Rogers Commission, is that the material used to create the O-ring became very brittle when it was exposed to cold temperatures. And one thing you don't want on an O-ring that is keeping gases from escaping and catching on fire and exploding everything is for it to become brittle. And so that was the problem. So why did they launch on the 28th? You could argue that's a good question. They probably shouldn't have launched on the 28th, but they did. And undoubtedly there was pressure on them to launch because they'd already had so many different delays. And the funny thing is, I don't know, Don and Dean, if you remember this, I remember this part too. I remember that there had been, several of these failed attempts at launching every day, and they kept scrubbing the mission. I remember that in the news. Obviously, it sticks in a little more with the eventual outcome of that mission, but it was something that was definitely there. It had definitely been reported on, and so because it was in the news, undoubtedly they had a lot of pressure from many different sources to say, hey, you gotta light this candle, guys. Can't be messing around.
I think that the delays and the scrubs were almost as routine as the launches. I mean, we just kind of got used to, they're not doing it again today, maybe tomorrow. But in this case, they also had a very unique reason. On day 4 of the scheduled flight, Krista McCullough was going to do a live demonstration science lesson that was going to be televised to all these kids all over the country. And if they didn't launch on Tuesday, the 28th, then day 4 would be on the weekend. And so that put a lot of pressure because they had already all this buildup and all these, I guess, plans and procedures and so forth in place to have this happen. And then, it would look like a failure. Even if it would have been a successful launch, it would have been a failed demonstration. Yeah, and then, of course, one of the decision makers on it is the company itself that is in charge of the SRB's manufacturer.
Yeah. Morton Thiokol, right?
Right.
Yeah.
and they stood to get a very large, many $1-million payout if they could meet schedule. And so delay after delay jeopardized their bottom line. Yeah. And this is the 80s. And, you know, we're a year away from Gordon Gekko and his, you know, greed is good. You can't overlook the dollar sign in the calculation.
No, that's definitely part of it.
And, you know, I actually think The Right Stuff, one of my favorite movies, whether it's historically accurate or not, it's a whole other thing. But there's, you know, what makes it go? Well, you know, money makes it fly. And, you know, where does the money come from? Well, this is a government program. I mean, again, to me, the juxtaposition, one of the other reasons I wanted to do this episode is the juxtaposition about what's going on now with space, the privatization, the commercialization of space that we see now with SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Amazon's effort here that I can't think of the name of now, all of a sudden, Blue Origin. And, you know, there are similarities and there are differences. In fact, the similarities are also striking. I'll talk about those in a minute here. But, you know, why did it fly? You know, Eric, I think you hit it on the head. Dean, you hit it on the head. It was about money. It was about hitting a window of time for the show that this was supposed to be from space. Why was it important to have that show? To bring it to the kids, to show there was value of still going, all the, you know, justifying. It's amazing how often we keep having to justify space exploration over and over again because it costs a lot of money to do. And so you keep having to re-justify it. And so there was like this micro time pressure, but then there was also a macro time pressure. Was this had been sold to Congress way back in the day of, again, becoming routine. You know, the other term that was used to describe the space shuttle was, it was the space truck. You know, it was the idea that it goes up, does what it does, delivers payload, comes back down, you know, basically change the oil, check the tires, you know, fill her back up, and it goes again, to the point that they expected each individual shuttle to be able, it was reusable. That was also one of the big financial sales for this, right? Not like those, you know, stupid Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo things that, you know, we use them one time and they're done kind of thing. But, it was reusable. Each shuttle was expected to have a life of about 100 launches or 10 years, whichever would come first. Do the math there. If you're going to get 100 flights in 10 years, the idea was that each shuttle was going to be turning around, give or take, you know, once every 4 to 6 weeks, sort of on the outside there. And the idea was that the tempo with the fleet of 4 was that there should almost be a weekly flight. And so I got curious today, knowing we were going to be preparing for this. What was you guys may know Eric may know the answer to this because he knows, you know, space enthusiast. He probably knows everything space. The theory was that the standard operating cadence was supposed to be a turnaround once every 4 to 6 weeks, right? So let's just say that on average, 30 to 45 days for the turnaround of a shuttle. And also the solid rocket boosters were reusable. So again, the only thing that's expendable is this big, huge tank.
Don, I think their stated goal, NASA's stated goal was 24 flights a year.
24 flights a year. And so again, the cadence you would expect is you need to be able to turn a shuttle around in 30 days, right? On average, that needs to be the average turnaround cadence to make this work. Anybody want to guess what the fastest turnaround was?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm thinking of some of the early missions. I don't know the answer to that, Don. What is the fastest turnaround? The
fastest turnaround is in the time frame that we're talking about, which I think also informs a lot of what we're doing here. It was Atlantis in 1985. It was launched on October 3, and then 54 days later, on November 26th, went back to space. That's the record. That's the fastest that ever happened. The average was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80 days. If I pull that up, I can probably get that here. I think I still have the tab that shows that. So my point of that being is that the program was designed for a 30 to 40 day turnaround being the maximum. Maybe you could go faster. They had hopes of maybe even going faster with this type of thing. The best they ever did was double that. And so the result was they were behind schedule. They were always behind schedule. You had all these little, what seemed to be trivial things that were causing these delays. And by the way, standing down a shuttle flight like they did on January 27th was not we just blew 10, $15. No, it was, that was probably well into several millions of dollars easy, for that stand down on the day before. And so the pressure was on in the micro sense. We got to hit the window so that Krista can do her thing from space. But the time pressure was also on in a macro sense of we're not moving shuttles as fast as we need to, guys. And we can't have this public relations optic being every time we turn around. Well, why didn't it fly today? Well, today it was the hatch. Why didn't it fly tomorrow? Well, it was the wind. Why didn't it fly the next day? Well, it was something else that seems relatively trivial. It's not trivial when 7 people then die. That changes the optic pretty quickly.
Right.
And to me, that's the irony of then and now, because what's actually being striven for now, what they're striving to do, what SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, what all these things are about is reusability.
Mm-hmm.
That SpaceX's big claim to fame, reusing everything, and fast turnaround. So here we are, fast forward 86 to 2022. So fast forward 35 years later, the goal still is reuse it and turn it around fast so that it's more economical. We're still chasing the same thing the space shuttle was chasing all the way back from its inception in the late 60s through the 70s and into the operational phase of the 80s. And then it has to stick around longer because there's no replacement for it. And they still haven't built this International Space Station. So they end up flying the shuttle for about 15 to 20 more years than what they ever dreamed its life was originally going to be. So it's literally, Bardeen's military experience, how many times was it hurry up and wait? There was a lot of hurry up and wait associated with the space program.
So one thing I'm thinking about, you hear a lot of talk of the interplay between science fiction and science. I'm thinking about the original Star Trek movies where they travel from Earth to some station that is orbiting Earth. You mentioned the International Space Station. And the idea of the shuttle is this is just to get you, this is the airport shuttle to get you from your house to where you're going to get the flight that takes you to Mars or to somewhere else. So we never built that airport. And I think Eric and I discussed this on the Apollo or the space race episodes we did. There was a goal there. You understood we're going to the moon. Implicit in the idea of a shuttle of the space truck is you're moving to something up there. Any truck today doesn't just drive around. It goes somewhere to do something. What are these shuttles going to do? So there isn't this station that's kind of a waypoint to further exploration. So we start looking for other things. And I think this is how we get into the gimmicks of, well, why don't we throw a teacher into there? Or why don't we throw an NFL defensive lineman? I'm sure Michael Strahan is a wonderful person. He comes across nice. What is shooting him up into space do other than publicity? So it's you're manufacturing these things we've done, and there isn't it feels more concrete, the goals of the earlier space program.
It definitely does, and it didn't really take very long for the the gimmicks to start happening. And some would even say some of the gimmicks were not really gimmicks. I mean, some of them, there was some valid scientific research that was done on the space shuttles that was helpful. It was useful. Does it justify the entire cost of the program? I don't know. I mean, that's hard to say. But then there's also, there's a commercial aspect of this. I mean, there's, this shuttle had a big cargo bay. I mean, relatively big cargo bay. And so you could put satellites in there. You could put, the Hubble Space Telescope. I mean, there's a lot of things you can put in that cargo bay that ended up turning out to be useful. But the fact that they're useful doesn't mean that there was a real personality to the program, or it doesn't mean that there was a real goal to the program. It was just sort of there. So I think that, and I agree with you, Chris. I think unless there's a mission, unless there's something that is intended, that is larger than the mission itself, people are going to lose interest.
Eric, you mentioned earlier a bright line. I think the Challenger on this topic here is the bright line, because afterwards, we talk about what it can carry. It was doing, before 86, it was doing a lot of commercial launches. NASA would take on these contracts to launch satellites for different telecommunications companies. That's why we have GPS now and so forth. But after the Challenger, it was relegated to strictly scientific and Defense Department payloads. So the whole commercial aspect of it kind of faded away. I don't know if that was an insurance thing, or did the government have to guarantee the payload? But for whatever reason, that's what happened.
Or Eric, from a technological perspective, if you're just throwing a satellite up there, do you need a manned reusable vehicle?
No, not at all.
Yeah,
unless it's cheaper.
Right. Well, and that was part of what the original, being my political science opted to it. That was the original sell to Congress, was that they thought that they could get payload delivery down to a couple of $100 a pound, which is a number we've come nowhere close to even yet. But the idea was that if you're able to go often enough, cheap enough, with reusable parts that you don't have to, you have to refurbish them. It costs money, but you can actually get the cost of this down to such that it becomes economically feasible. To your point, Dean, that you did not see as many just regular satellite launches after the Challenger disaster in 86. They still carried up military cargo because, sort of else the government, carrying military cargo makes sense. But it was also that, to Chris's point, it's cheaper, and I can get insurance or whatever I need to back up this idea. If I go on a regular proven rocket, that's just all it needs to be. It doesn't need a person to go. I'm just carrying cargo up to a point in space, and we understand how the physics and gravity work on that. It didn't make sense. Having said that, Hubble's 91 or so, if I remember correctly, Eric. And it's ironic now the James Webb telescope has just been launched and is making its way now as we're recording this episode. But I mean, the pictures from Hubble blew away anything else we had ever had before. But if you remember, Hubble had a problem when it first went up.
Yeah. So
they actually had to execute a repair mission on Hubble to get it to be what it came out to be. The only thing that it was capable anywhere of doing that type of repair mission at that time, because of what they had to take up, was this thing called the space shuttle. So you were able to launch Hubble because you had the space shuttle and what you needed there. And then you were able to actually go up and service and repair Hubble because you had the space shuttle. I would argue that at the end of the day, from what I understand about what astronomy has gained from the Hubble, you can almost make the case that the whole shuttle program was worth it because of Hubble. If you had to make that case, the International Space Station's a nice plus because of all the research that goes on there with a permanently manned station. But you're right, Chris, ain't nothing sexy about that.
Yeah. I mean, I take your point, Don. I would say that some sort of manned space program would have been necessary for launching the Hubble and then the servicing missions. Now, that just so happened that the space shuttle program was the program we had,
right?
And so it was and so you can. And you're never going to get me to ever say things like, space travel and space programs are not worth the money, because I absolutely believe that they are. But there are different sort of programs that have some benefits and some drawbacks. But yeah, that was a bit of a boondoggle. I mean, that was a joke when Hubble, which is a shame, because Hubble, when you think about the technology at the time, it was 1990. The technology at the time for Hubble was incredible, but there was one mirror that was just a little out of alignment, and it took until 1993 to execute the first repair. But what we've gotten from the Hubble and what we're going to get from James Webb is going to be absolutely incredible. But we are literally we have seen and what we will see with James Webb is we will see into the very origins of the universe, which is incredible.
Yeah, and I was watching something, just the complexity of that you mentioned things being obsolete when they, to some degree, James Webb is obsolete as it goes up because of how long it takes to develop these things. But
right.
The nature of the technology is that space is always cutting edge to a degree because it has to be at its very beginning. Whether it gets surpassed quickly now in our technology stream is a whole different thing. But most of the technologies we enjoy that are terrestrial today exist because there was a space program. Why do we have the computers that we do? They needed the computers that would do the types of things that were needed for space flight. And oh, by the way, we get the benefit of them because of, it's the tangential things that are probably multiple orders of magnitude more valuable than the actual, and the pure science is pretty valuable, but even more, the applied science that comes out of it is, we don't even recognize how much of our current, the stuff that I'm looking at here around my office as we talk, how much of this is because of space. A lot of it is.
To ask a really interesting question, Eric. Space Shuttle was kind of designed to be a Swiss Army knife. It's a big truck that we can send up regularly. For things like manned Hubble and Webb maintenance, do you think, and this is just a thought, that where we are and what's happened recently with commercial launches, the ability to specialize your platform to an extent that you can do different things? Or do you think that makes it efficient to specialize, whereas the Space Shuttle was a government program where we're going to build one thing and it's going to be able to do everything good enough?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the best description of the shuttle program overall. It allows some amount of flexibility to do a lot of different tasks good enough. Even though it was, and we can talk about this a little bit. It was arguably pretty obsolete technology even before it was implemented. So it was and Don, you mentioned Space Transportation System, STS, and this was not a 1970s proposal. It was a 1969 proposal,
right?
For that, and it was, the way they described it, it was pretty good technology for 1969 that they described, but we ended up using that technology until 2011. I mean, what other technology that is that crucial would we use for that long? And would we not bother to come up with a replacement? I mean, I'm sure we could probably think of some examples, but probably not very many.
I remember the first
comes to mind.
Yeah, I remember yeah, exactly. Talk about something that's outlived its expected usefulness, the B-52. But I actually remember the first shuttle launch. I remember as a kid, it launched on a Saturday morning. I remember that. And we had a place up in the country about an hour north of Houston. And so we had okay television. This is, pre-satellite, pre-cable up there. So we were lucky that we were able to get a good enough picture for me to watch it that morning. But I remember when it was delayed. Do you guys remember all the reason the first launch got delayed? Okay. No. Enough suspense there. I think there were 4 or 5 primary computers on the orbiter. So you had backups, basically there was a series of computers that ran, there was a series that ran parallel to each other so that you had constant backups that were going on. And the first thing they ran into was the fact that when those computers did some type of synchronization maneuver or process at like 29 or 31 seconds before launch, they were all supposed to get on the same time sync with each other so that they would be able to do that. And something went wrong. And so the countdown automatically got stopped, properly so, when a system detected that the computers are not properly synced with each other, so that if something happened, they wouldn't be able to take over for each other. So this is literally what it was. What you do every day when you plug some type of USB thing into some type of computer today, and some type of very, very fast sync happens that does, file syncs, file transfer, syncs time, whatever it does. We hadn't quite mastered that with 5 computers in 1981 like we needed to. And as a result, the first shuttle launch doesn't go off smoothly because 5 computers sitting next to each other can't get together on what time it is. And the reason for that to some degree is that that's where computer technology was at that day. In fact, that was still almost cutting edge, computer technology. Fast forward to today, again, using SpaceX as the example here, I think they're by far the most ambitious of all the private space enterprise that's going on out there. Certainly, they're spending more of Elon's money than he acts like a government in terms of how much money that he's spending. But they're using, to some degree, hardened, quote unquote, high-end, off-the-shelf computers in, for example, in the Dragon spacecraft, because that's how far the technology has evolved that you can do that today. Whereas before it was a special, it was a special built computer. The computers on the Apollo on the limbs on the Apollo missions were, very, I'm holding my smartphone up now, 1 billion times more powerful this is than that was, kind of things in terms of what it can do. But all of that is, the fact that we're sitting in, collectively there's 3,000 miles of distance between the five of us talking here, and we're doing this with crystal clear video on a platform that, doesn't require a special setup like you have at NORAD or the White House Situation Room to do. This is space technology. Mm-hmm. Part of this internet signal probably is bouncing somewhere off of a satellite or bouncing off of something like that, or taking advantage of those networks. And, that's the result of what we get. When the pressure comes and the program stops, or the rest of the program, there's a lot of people that realize this is not just about what Chris was talking about. What are the goals and objectives of this space program? But realizing all this other tangential development gets impacted if the dollars get pulled as well. Right. And there's a lot of pressure to have that go forward.
And so we've talked a lot about what happened on the day of and the day before, kind of the actual room and mission control. But, one of the things that we should probably touch on is some of the aftermath of the Challenger accident, because there was a lot of aftermath, and it changed a lot of things about the space program. And I personally feel like this was sort of it was the long death knell of the shuttle program, because I don't think, after these flights resumed, they weren't on TV anymore. My mom didn't get me up to, watch the shuttle launches, just because they weren't there, or at least not reliably so. And a lot of the shuttle launches it became a non-event, and it faded into the background, with the exception of a few, again, gimmick stunts that occurred, that were kind of punctuated by, long stretches of missions where scientific research was done. That's good. Payloads were delivered, but there's not a lot of fanfare, and except with things like the original Hubble launch in 1990, where something went wrong, and then NASA became a butt of a joke. So I think that's one thing that we could consider. But I think if we're looking at this from the more immediate standpoint, what actually happened to investigate the Challenger accident, we have to talk about the Rogers Commission. And so I don't know if anybody wants to discuss a little bit about what the Rogers Commission actually was.
I'll go there. Just real quick, it's like what you often have after any major event, be it the Warren Commission, be it the Tower Commission. We're pretty good at creating commissions whenever we have to investigate something in this country. And so in this case, it was Presidential Blue Ribbon Select Commission. And, the commissions always sort of, in my opinion, have two broad thrusts that are related to them. One of them is, their job is to find out what happened, right? And that starts to be, some element of assigning blame or responsibility by the very nature of what it is. And then it becomes about, once you identify what it is, making sure it doesn't happen again. And so in this case, William Rogers had been Secretary of State, former Attorney General. So he has credibility, although he's not a scientist. So you mentioned earlier, Richard Feynman, he's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. Neil Armstrong is the vice chairman of that commission. That's one of the first things I remember jumping out at me is, what happened to Neil? Well, the next time you sort of see Neil again is when he's, brought back out for the Rogers Commission, because he had sort of gone on to what he was doing. But you had a combination of, I'm just reading through the list here,
different sort of gravitas with different people,
different reasons. David Atchison, who had, the son of former Secretary of State. You have scientists from the Air Force. You have Feynman. But then you have others that are there, obviously, for, I guess, window dressing, for lack of a better way to describe it. Chuck Yeager is on the, okay, everybody's going to believe, part of his credibility, everybody's going to believe Chuck Yeager, right? I mean, he's Chuck Yeager. There's two Chucks that you have to pay attention to, Chuck Yeager and Chuck Norris, which everything is sort of said and done. But Sally Ride.
Chuck Yeager was on TV like every commercial break back then.
Right. Sally Ride, who of course is known, she's an astronaut, but she's known for being the first female American in space. And so, they go out and they do this. Basically, they're looking to find the root cause analysis. What caused this? And then it's, then making the recommendations about what happens moving forward. That's the Rogers Commission in a summary. It's designed to find out what happened and what do we do next. And others may have different interpretations or thoughts about that. I'd love to hear them, but it's typically what we do in the United States after there's been a problem is we form a commission to look into it, whatever looking into it means.
Right. Well, this particular commission found some very concerning things, and made some very specific recommendations. I think one of the things that was always shocking to me was not only that there was a technical failure. So we know that the proximal cause is the failure of the O-ring that was at the aft field joint of the right SRB. So that's the proximal cause. We've kind of discussed this, that there was that leaking of gas and damage to the external tank. What's interesting is not that happened so much, although that's interesting. It's that we knew this could happen, and that was the thing that was really shocking when you really dig into it. They knew that the O-rings were not fault tolerant to certain external factors like cold temperatures. And this design flaw was known as early as 1977. And so this is kind of the whole idea that the space shuttle was obsolete before it was even launched. Well, this is one example of where if not obsolete, then at least flawed in design. So we had 9 years to fix it, and we didn't. And that struck me as kind of a big deal. The other thing about the report is they were very critical of the decision by NASA to launch Challenger. Even though there was some pressure on them to do so because of multiple scrubbed launches, we knew, again, as I'd mentioned before, it was the ambient temperature was 12 degrees cooler than the coldest, quote unquote, safe temperature for those O-rings, which was 39 degrees. And also, that even if it had been 39 degrees, it had been colder recently. And so, we don't know what the effects of kind of repeated warming and cooling cycles on those O-rings would be as well. That may have its own implications for the integrity of those O-rings, but they were very critical of those two things, both the kind of the culture and decision making at NASA and the technology itself. So this commission had a number of different recommendations to improve the safety of the program, and one of them is just an entire redesign of the whole apparatus. So you just completely redesign the whole thing, and then also just keeping in mind different ideas of management structure, different decision making there. Keeping astronauts involved in the decision making process, because one of the ironies here is you had these 7 astronauts who, in theory, knew a thing or two about astronauting, and they were not involved in any of this decision making. They were kind of kept in the dark about a lot of this, and that that is unfortunate that was the case, because they might have had some very different opinions because it was their necks on the line, so to speak. But that was those were just some basic things that the Rogers Commission reported back to President Reagan. And it took 32 months before we went back to space. We didn't go back to space until September of 1988. And that was a different orbiter, Discovery. But it took us that long. And I also remember that big pause in shuttles, that we had this 2.5 years where there were no shuttles. I remember that, that it was unusual for the time.
So,
it also created issues because, again, you couldn't move forward with the International Space Station. You couldn't move forward with the things that were now dependent upon the one thing, the space truck, that wasn't flying, that you needed to really be able to do this. You were sort of stuck in everything that you were doing because this was the one thing that was there. I'm sorry, Chris.
No. So there's one of the 1980s era astronauts, a guy named Mike Mullane, who Eric might know who I'm talking about, came out with a series of speeches about what he called the normalization of deviance, which is they start seeing these O-rings come back damaged, and it hasn't blown up yet. So you're telling your story earlier, Don, of 5 computers not being able to sync on exactly the right time, and that shut down the launch. That really seems like a tiny thing. And what it talks about, or what he's talking about is, well, let's go ahead and launch with just 4 of the computers agreeing. And if it doesn't blow up next time, it's going to be a lot easier to launch with maybe 3. So, the one thing is, not only in the 70s did they say, hey, this could be a problem, the majority of those earlier launches, they were seeing damage to these O-rings that should never have happened. And the one thing I'm thinking about is, everybody who's dealt with any government agency understands, well, let's shut down everything just because a couple of checklists aren't matched.
Well,
it's interesting. Maybe that's a good idea, and maybe that makes a shuttle program a better idea than somebody, Elon Musk out there in a corporate environment has a very different set of priorities.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you bring up Mullane, because not only was he very critical of NASA culture overall, he experienced this himself. He was not in Challenger, of course, but he was on Atlantis when it was in a mission, and I don't remember the year. It was probably pretty, I don't know, late 80s sometime, 88, 89. He was on Atlantis, and Atlantis had sustained some pretty severe damage to heat shield tiling. And eventually it was a safe landing, but that was not a given, considering what happened. And so that, I think, to me, I wonder if that kind of spurred him to be a little more critical of that, even though he ended up, I think he flew again after that mission. But yeah, he is kind of known for being critical of the space program and just culture of NASA's astronaut corps.
That culture of it. And I'm thinking about, we were talking about that one contractor who had manufactured the boosters and wanted this to launch, so they got that incentive. Well, one of the things about what's going on in Challenger is these mixing of those two cultures, right? Of that government culture. They're starting to outsource some of these things to somebody whose goal is that bottom line. And that's a problem. And that's identified as a problem in the postmortem on Challenger. Is the right solution to get the safety first NASA engineers completely out of it, which seems to be kind of what we've done today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the engineers at the company itself, what's the name of the vehicle?
Morton vehicle. Yeah.
Vehicle. The engineers themselves were aware of the problem and were trying to do something about it, but were stopped by management. Yeah. And there's the famous, midnight call on the 27th to try to scrub the 28th launch, instigated by the engineers, but ultimately management wins out. So it wasn't just the NASA engineers per se, but even private sector engineers were kind of locked out of the decision making, and it all came down to the dollars.
Not to denigrate business school graduates, but
right.
Well, but technical people know some things.
Of course, wouldn't have gone up without them, obviously. Yeah.
But you always get back to you guys talked about this on the A Fork in Time episode. The concept of groupthink that snuck into the Bay of Pigs. planning and what was going on there. Decision making is challenging just by the nature of what it is. You get more effective decision making when you centralize it in one person, but you put all that responsibility in one person. Once two people are involved in the decision making process, you now have a process because you got more than one person involved. And if the risk reward trade off is what you always get expressed. And we were talking about this. The flights have become complacent. The assumption was nothing can go wrong. You don't even need to wear spacesuits. Just wear some jumpsuits with a helmet. You'll be fine. Kind of thing.
Almost sending them up in the polo with the logo on it. That as long as you get the logo on it, you're okay.
You're good to go.
Yeah. And we sort of gone back to that now. Some of the commercial flights, we were mentioning earlier the Blue Origin flight from a couple of weeks ago. I guess if I had played defensive line for the Giants, I too could have gone to space, I guess, is the moral of this story. But we know that it's not without risk, and we know that in the broader sweep of just taking this topic and carrying it broad, people die in the course of exploration. That's the nature of the way exploration has always been. What's an acceptable amount of death? What's an acceptable amount of risk? What's the risk reward? That's engineers do play those games with running the numbers on, is this an acceptable risk or not? Well, if you're one of the families of those seven, if you're the families of those seven folks, or you are those seven folks on Challenger, there's no risk that's acceptable once it goes bad, but there's risk involved. And so, this is the nature, I think, that we always face anytime we're talking about science or cutting edge science or exploration, is what makes it exciting. And one of the reasons that we follow it is that there's an element of risk to it. It's not the mundane. But we also need to realize that, how many millions of working parts had to work right for a shuttle launch to go off? Well, millions. Most of the time they would, and there were backup systems. There were all that was there. But there have been deaths in the U.S. space program. There have been deaths in the other space programs. The Soviet space program, there's the ones we know about and the ones that we're still finding out about in terms of what actually happened during that program, because so much was, suppressed. This just in, there's going to be more. SpaceX is going to have a fatality at some point. And what will be different, I guess this is one of the reasons I also want to talk about this as a concept, is it's one thing when it's the government and you form a select commission, and you can pull together Nobel Prize winning physicists and famous astronauts and former attorney generals and all the things that go with that. If SpaceX, again, just using them as an example because they're currently in the news, if they have an accident tomorrow, there's going to be investigation, there's going to be insight, all the things that are there, but it's going to be different because it's in the commercial realm. Would you agree with that, Eric?
Yeah, I definitely would agree. I think we have a little more tolerance for government sponsored programs being risky, partly because we have more experience with it. I mean, even just military, we have experience with it. Whereas I think if you're a publicly traded company, I think you not only do you have the court of public opinion, you also have to answer to your shareholders, and your shareholders may get a little squeamish if they feel like there's blood in their hands. Yeah.
And, the other thing I think about there is the government then investigating private companies about the level of safety that they're going to make. To me, this is one of the interesting things that I think we will see unfold over the next decade as space becomes commercialized, privatized, is that, what is the proper assumption of risk? What is the regulatory oversight still going to be, even though it's a private commercial entity? That's, again, I keep coming back to SpaceX. It's the one I'm most familiar with, and it's probably the most in the news. They're still waiting for some of their final clearance as the recording of this episode for their first suborbital flight for Starship. And okay, that makes sense. But they're a private enterprise. Mm-hmm. Especially when the first one's going to be unmanned. Okay, as long as they make sure, I know in the environmental impact, yes, it's going to impact, the where they're launching from, the other things. I think the interesting thing to watch that's played out over the next 10 to 20 years is how is regulation going to come into the space program. And looking back 35 years ago to a disaster for a governmental program is probably not going to be the standard that things are held to. Is the first place I think about, and how it's going to be different. And as it becomes normal, and it becomes normal. There will somewhere probably while we've been recording, no doubt, just because statistics are there. There's been an automobile fatality somewhere in the United States.
Oh, lots of them.
Yeah,
40,000 a year.
Yeah, so it will be investigated as it properly should be, and there'll be other things are there. But all of our cars are not going to be locked down tomorrow because we've decided what the appropriate level of risk reward is there. Space is going to turn into that over the next 40 to 50 years, where we're establishing those sort of same, what's just like airline flight, commercial airline travel, that type of thing. What's the acceptable trade-off here? The setting during Challenger was different than what it's going to be now.
I think that's thought with what you just said, which is, crunching the numbers. Eric's recent experience flying from Chicago aside, commercial air travel is remarkably safe. And yet when something goes wrong, it goes really wrong, and it goes wrong on TV.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and I think that if I could kind of tie this all together, what I would say is that the problem with the Challenger accident, obviously loss of 7 lives, that's a tragedy. But I think that the broader problem is not just that this occurred, because again, you take an assumption of risk when you travel in space. It's this occurred partly due to negligence, partly due to poor decision making and poor planning, partly due to over reliance on kind of outmoded systems. And so there's a lot of things here that happened that could have been prevented. That could have been anticipated, and they weren't. And so to me, that's the kind of the take home point is, yes, there is risk in this, and yes, if you throw up enough space vehicles, there's going to be accidents, there's going to be fatalities, but they shouldn't happen because of preventable causes. And that's kind of where a lot of the Rogers Commission kind of took some of that to heart. But that still didn't prevent things happening with the Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003. A different set of circumstances, although you could argue a different set of management failures, or a similar set of management failures on the part of NASA. So I think that there's obviously some lessons to be learned from that.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about Columbia as we've been talking all through this. We talk so much about Challenger. We talk far less about Columbia for a number of reasons. One of them is we watched a video of what happened with Challenger. We know what happened with Columbia, but there's no similar visual seminal event. The fact that it was on reentry versus launch, makes it a different thing as well. But I was struck by, as I was reading through some of the stuff, and I was doing that today, Eric, is that yes, NASA learned the lessons, but they didn't, because what happens with Columbia, you can say you didn't learn the lesson or else you wouldn't have done this, because they knew that there were issues with, some of the ice break off and the heat towel stuff and all that. And so, thankfully there hasn't been another accident since then. It's only a matter of time.
Right.
Will we learn the lessons from the next thing? And then that's why I bring up the commercial aspect of things. If that's in a commercial environment, you're right, Chris, air travel is incredibly safe when you look at the number of folks and the number of things that are there. When it goes bad, it goes bad. But it's safer. It's safer. I mentioned cars. It's safer than getting into your car, as a rule of thumb. As space becomes routine, will we think of it more like Challenger? Will we think of it more like, hopping on a plane? Which will we think of it as?
I think space is always going to be like flight, in that when something goes wrong, it's going to be viewed as disastrous, and it's going to be covered wall-to-wall coverage. I mean, 7 people, there have been 7 road fatalities since we started reporting.
I think it depends on how routine this becomes. I mean, if space travel becomes incredibly routine, then maybe not. Maybe it'll become like an air crash and not like a car crash.
No, I think space will always be more akin to a air crash, in that it's bigger and it's scarier somehow. I don't know how to put it.
Well, yeah, it is. It's much grander than mundane forms of travel that we do every day. And I guess I would also say when we learn lessons from, from a lot of these incidents, I think we tend to learn narrow lessons, not broad lessons. So you fix the O-ring, you don't fix the insulation foam. Well, that's a problem. Maybe that it's a problem that takes 17 years to figure out, but you still figured it out, and you figured it out the hard way.
I'd also add that it's a matter of perceptions. If you're the passenger getting on an airliner today, you want to feel that it's routine and everything's normal and it's safe and it's comfort. Right. But you don't want the people maintaining the aircraft or flying the aircraft to feel that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's
I would say space should probably be the same way. And I think the commission report clearly indicates that too many people in the Challenger incident, and probably with Columbia as well, were too routine about problems and the way things were being done in NASA and the contractors.
And and routine, quote unquote defects in things like the computer systems and stuff like that hadn't caused problems before, but were still not normal operating. No, I think that's a good point. Any other last minute comments from the group? I think we've done an hour and a half on 73 seconds. I think that's our new time dilation record, guys. All right.
I think that's fair enough. Eric, please go ahead and close out.
Very good. So thank you, Don, Dean, Chris. Thank you for joining for this discussion. This is one that I've been looking forward to for a very long time. So please, for those of you who are listening, tell your friends about A Room Where It Happened. Also tell your friends, and if you haven't yourself checked it out, please check out A Fork in Time and tell your friends about that as well. This has really become very much a team effort. I've said this on a couple of these other episodes of A Room Where It Happened, but I started out as a listener and then became a patron and eventually have become part of the team, and that's been a really great experience for me. And so we really want this to be a participatory, and I think Don's used the word community, and I think that's a wonderful word for it. I think it really is becoming a community of people who are enthusiastic about history and enthusiastic about alternate history. So thank you for joining us for this episode 6 of A Room Where It Happened. We look forward to having you join us again for Room 7.